Next up, we have Dr. Christine Pelland. Christine is a veterinarian and a partner at Southwest, and she holds a master's degree in swine reproduction. Today, Christine will be talking to us about gilt management and maximizing reproductive potential.
Hi. Thanks everybody for coming. I am totally going to switch gears from everything you've heard up to this point. So maybe that's a good thing. There's been a lot of disease challenge and heavy discussions on PRRS virus and so forth. So this is another aspect of production that I probably affects most of you in the room, and so thought it was pertinent to have a chat about. So broadly speaking, we're going to look at a reproductive tool that we can use. When actually we were preparing for this, I'm going like, how do I present this? How do I start this discussion, Marty? And we were talking about it back and forth, and he goes, well, you're going to focus on the guilty party, and literally the gilts. And when you think of them as the guilty party, that sort of, to me, it's our unruly teenagers. They're the problem population in our herds coming into sow barns. And is there ways that we can reduce our level of frustration, make them more effective once they enter into the sow barns, and get them into our productive herd as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and with the least amount of stress? So that was kind of what the first slide meant. So where I was going with this is that if we lean into our colleagues in the dairy industry, right? So cattle utilize products like prostaglandins, FSH, progesterone, and that's become kind of a cornerstone of how to increase productive days in that industry. Pigs are not the same physiologically. I'm not going to make direct comparisons here, but we do have some tools that we can use similar to what they do to manipulate different aspects of a gilt cycle to help us out at the end of the day. So can we use a product like Regulate to help us out? And I'll get into that a little bit more. But where I'm going with this is, can we help ourselves? So we're sow producers that bring in groups of gilts on some level of frequency. Now, that's not always the situation, right? You may have internal replacements that you're not bringing them in from an external source, but you do have a population at some point in time where you're going to be looking at making sure that they're coming into heat at the appropriate time, that they're a certain weight by a certain age, and that they fit into your herd efficiently thereafter. So we want to reduce the open days and carrying costs from entrance or selection to productivity. As a producer, in one circumstance, you might be paying a royalty on every gilt entering your herd on the assumption that every one of those animals becomes a productive female and falls into the category of, you're going to be productive for me until parity 3 at least. And we would arbitrarily say if you can get 75% of the gilts or more that enter into your herd as a select animal and they make it to parity 3 as being productive, then we're on the right track. Now we want to push that number. We want to get that to 85. We want to get that to 90. But we've got either disease pressure or injury, all of that play into it. So we're striving for greater than 75%. And ultimately, though, we want to reduce the overall frustration with your gilts in general. So this darn guilty party that we're dealing with. So when we think of hormones, I don't want to bog you down in too much of this, but it is important to understand some of the main ones that we're dealing with. So we've got 4 prominent hormones if we're thinking of a gilt cycle here. And this can be sows as well, but we're talking about gilts that are prominently involved in gilts coming into heat or maintaining pregnancy. So follicle stimulating hormone, you're a gilt, you're developing, you're coming up to the right age, the right weight, where you might start to come into heat. What's happening on those ovaries is that follicles are starting to develop. This green line here is what is released to start developing those follicles. So it sort of increases as the gilt ages and gets a little bit bigger. FSH will develop those follicles. As those follicles get bigger, they stimulate estrogen. Estrogen, of course, is directly related to those external signs of heat for gilts, right? So that is what needs to be higher to see the gilt receptive to the bore, to see her responsiveness to back pressure, to see a swollen vulva at the back end. All of that is driven by this uptick in estrogen. So those follicles are growing, growing, growing. More estrogen is surging through her body, and then that hits a threshold where LH is released, and that's luteinizing hormone. What that hormone does is bursts those follicles. It makes all the big follicles burst, and then the eggs are released into the uterus, and then either conceived or not after that. As soon as that's released, that follicle scars down on the ovary, and that scarred up follicle starts to produce progesterone. And that slowly comes up and is high for a certain period of time. And when it starts to reduce is when all these other hormones start to increase again. So important to understand sort of conceptually what these four things do. Regulate is progesterone. So progesterone, as I just described, is high when all of these other ones are low. Meaning, if we have high progesterone levels, we're going to have lower FSH, estrogen, and LH, and therefore dampening of signs of estrus. Or it's present if we are looking to maintain pregnancy. So follicles will give, the burst follicles will produce progesterone for a certain period of time, but then they start to regress. They don't last forever. Where progesterone continues to be high is if she's pregnant. So at a point in time here, if she conceives, then the fetuses actually start producing progesterone and maintain the rest of the pregnancy. So we can use Regulate as a synthetic source of progesterone to manipulate some of these things for us so that we can maybe fit gilt more when we need them. So I just described all that. So if we've got a high progesterone level in a gilt's body, and then you all of a sudden remove it, we get Niagara Falls. We get Niagara Falls of FSH, estrogen, and LH. So that's an important concept to understand when we're using a tool like Regulate. When we have Regulate on board, we are dampening the effects of all those other hormones, and this is the predominant trigger for the gilt. So Regulate in general is, well, it's a synthetic progesterone. It's a little bit finicky, so we have to use it right so that it works to our advantage. So there's some key concepts that we need to understand about this in order to make it right. So there's two doses that you can use for Regulate, simply divided as a gilt versus a sow, and that's a direct correlation to body weight. So 7 mils in gilts, 9 mils in sows. This product lasts in the body for 24 hours, in a gilt system for 24 hours, but hormones are metabolized and absorbed by different tissues quite quickly, so it loses its effectiveness in the overall body system within 24 hours. So we need to give Regulate every day, about 24 hours apart, to get the result that we want. That's an important factor in the effectiveness of this. It's an oral administration. So this product is given as a squirt in the mouth or as a top dress on feed. They like the taste, which is great. Sometimes we look to training to make sure that they're not scared of us coming and squirting something in their mouth before we actually want to give them the product. But I'll talk a little bit about some experiences with that in the scenarios I've got. And like I said earlier, we need to feed this continuously for a period of time, specifically talking about gilts with unknown heat statuses. So a population of animals that either has just come from a gilt isolation barn or just come from a different site, and we don't know if they started to cycle or not. the recommendation would be to feed Regulate for a continuous sequence of 14 to 18 days. And I'll get into that a little bit more, again, with a scenario as well. When we want to see heats in these gilts that we're feeding Regulate to, you stop Regulate. That allows the waterfall to start falling. It takes a few days for those hormones to hit a certain peak before we'll see outward signs of heats. So we're seeing heats come about 3 to 5 days, start about 3 to 5 days after you stop the use of this product. And we just put a little caution here. This is a hormone that can affect people. So anybody giving this hormone needs to be mindful of that. It can be absorbed through the skin, so you want to wear gloves, and it's a liquid, so you want to make sure that you're handling it appropriately. So just in general here, what we're talking about is we've often got populations of gilts with maybe unknown heat status when we want to start them to coming into heat, and then we do a lot of effort into exposing them to borers. A cycle for a gilt or a sow is 21 days. Broken up would be about 3 weeks. And oftentimes the ones that don't fit in this 3-week cycle, we can lose track of, or they fall off the radar, or they get too heavy. So these are the areas of a bit of a question mark. So can we reduce that, those questionable time periods? Sue had the opportunity to obtain information from a couple different scenarios within the practice that utilized Regulate in slightly different ways to see if ultimately we could make better use of their gilt pool. And there were different reasons why we did different things. So by no means is this tidy trials, as Courtney would put together, but it's more observation, some initial results after doing this for a period of time, and then suggestions on how you might pivot going forward, or go, we tried it, didn't work the way I wanted, so let's move on, or man, I'm onto something. This has really helped the system deal with the gilt pool. So scenario one. Regulate is a production tool used in all incoming gilts. So I will paint a picture for you. So 2200 sow farm, Topig Genetics, delved into the use of Regulate because there were too many gilts in each group that would not show heat or not be bred. About 30 out of 150 in a group, that's 20%, coupled with staffing and poor heat detection challenges. Cost is certainly on the radar here, but was not the primary motivation. They were just cross-eyed frustrated with dealing with the gilts. So to paint the picture of the flow, every 5 weeks, about 150 gilts would enter from an isolation barn. Historically, like I said, 20% of the gilts would not show a strong heat and therefore would not be bred and ultimately were not productive. The Regulate protocol that was trialed in this scenario was gilts were brought over to the sow barn. And the way it was described to me is that they had 2 stall rows that all the gilts were placed into. So out of 150, they came over, they were placed in 2 specific rows of stalls. They were trained on apple juice for about 2 days. So they came in, you've got your little drencher gun, someone went by about the same time every day and drenched with apple juice. That was to train the pigs, but also the people and the applicator, and to make sure everything was functioning properly. And then everybody was started on Regulate. What happened thereafter was that the producer would come through on a weekly basis and select subsets of those 150 to fit targets for the following week. So I need 20 gilts to be bred next week out of this population. So they would go through and strategically select. I would assume that on their mind would be size and age. So you're going to strategically select your bigger, older gilts first. And those gilts who are targeted to fit in to be bred next week would be moved from those 2 breeding stall rows over, the regumate stall into a breeding stall area. Once they moved over to the breeding stall area, they were no longer given regumate and they were started to be exposed to the boar. Then we looked at when they came into heat after and subsequently bred. And so that's some of the information I've got to fill you in on. So just briefly here, to conceptualize, what we did with some of the data I'll show you is that, so about March of 2023 through until sometime in August, we collected information on the girls that came in from isolation and were subject to this protocol. Then we sort of loosely referenced backwards in time to see how the performance might have changed by the difference in the protocol. So this is what was found. So if we're looking at our groups historically to our group with regumate, as I just described, the number of gilts entered, they're not the same, but there was enough power in the amount that came in. The average entry age was 165 and 180. There's a range, guys. This isn't like super tidy data, but it just gives you a snapshot on what we're looking at as a population there. The average entry to first service. So historically, when they came from the isolation to the sow barn, on average, it would take 39 days for them to get bred for the first time. With the regumate group, it was more 36 days, but we did that. We made that 36 days because we chose when they came off regumate and when they were allowed to get bred and exposed to the boar. So this is a little bit arbitrary because that's what we chose in this situation. Average age or average entry to first service age. So this is just showing that, all right, well, we're breeding them for the first time at around that 220 days. And that didn't change drastically, right? When we say entry to first service greater than 42 days, 42 days was picked because that's 2 full cycles, right? So they come into the sow barn, they were exposed to boars. Did they come into heat and we heat no service them and bred them on their second heat by 42 days? Because like the best gilt would absolutely be bred by 42 days, even if she was heat no serviced and then bred on the second heat, right? So we want most of them to fit in under 42 days. So 36% historically would have gone past that. 28% with our regumate use happen to do that quicker. And then service outcomes here, and we say pregnant or farrowed because historically we've got all the farrowing data, but girls that were bred in August, we still don't have that farrowing data for. So it's incomplete on the farrowing. However, fallout rate isn't drastic, so we just sort of took that number. What we're saying here is we didn't reduce performance, and in fact, there's areas of opportunity here with the use of that protocol with regumate. I was really curious about this because that's sort of my jam is looking at hormones and how they affect different animals. So bear with me because I think it's really neat information that we gained from some of this. So average number of days on regumate, 25, but again, we did that. So the girl that had the least number of days on regumate was 6, and it did go up to 41, but we chose that. Percentage of gilts bred post-regumate, 99%. So they almost all got bred. Now, there was a range, though, in the breed day post-regumate. So I'll break that down for us, but the average day was about 6 post-regumate removal. So this is the really cool one. Because we just put everybody on it and we took them off when we wanted them to, we didn't follow any recipes in this scenario. So what actually did they do for us? If you remember to the first slide, in a population like this, the recommendation would be minimum 14 days, if not 18. And the 14-day comes more from a North American approach to using regumate in this population. The 18 days is far more European. They would absolutely recommend going for no less than 18 days in an unknown heat status for a gilt. So I wanted to know if that made sense in these circumstances. So Regulate duration, I made these up. These are just me going, I'm drawing a line here. What did they do after that? So less than 10 days, if you were a Gilt and you got Regulate for less than 10 days, how quickly did you come back into heat? So about 30% came in within the first week, but the bulk of them came between 1 and 2 weeks post removal of Regulate. That biologically makes sense. They were pulled off too early. Most of them probably weren't in a point where they pulled the Regulate out and that waterfall effect happened right away because they needed a little bit more time. And then we have a smattering down here. This makes biological sense. We just missed her. We pulled her off Regulate. We didn't see an obvious heat. It was muted. And then she came into heat a full cycle later, or just after that. Interestingly enough, the 11 to 19 days, this is in their sweet spot, right? This would be our recommendation. So pulling them off, if they had it for 11 to 19 days, almost 70% came in within a week. 30% came in slightly later, and then we've got a smattering thereafter. And if you go greater than 20 days, what gives us the best result, it just comes down to cost at that point. And are you going to put the cost into regulating or more heat detection focus, right? So it works. And our recommendation for that 14 days seems to have merit here. It's not that it doesn't work, but it's far more predictable. So this just reinforces what I was saying, but also, the days by which they come back into heat post Regulate removal, the average was 7 days if it was less than 14 days that they got Regulate, and 5 days if it was more, following along the same train of thought there. So overall comments here. Really need, in this circumstance, if you were to endeavor into this scenario, you need a good person to identify which Gilts are supposed to, you want to have come off of Regulate for the next week. And that's very important early on. The longer you go on Regulate, the better response we get. But those early girls, you really have to identify the ones that are a little bit older, a little bit heavier. And I would argue that based on this information, we could probably tweak this. And you could probably get away with selecting those first 20 girls and not putting them on Regulate in the first week, just checking for heats. So there's room for tweaks here. But that all falls back to management and simplicity and a tool and using it for why you endeavored to use it in the first place. And if management and the simpleness of just putting them all on trumps some of the other stuff, then that's the situation. The culling rate on the non-service Gilts has improved. So they've been able to retain more Gilts from that 150. And having the advantage of, if you don't have a lot of time to do heat detection, the strategy that they used allowed you to focus on those 20 that you put in the breed row versus having to run the boar down 2 lengths of stalls for 150 Gilts. So you can spend more time on those individuals to check for heats. So some big pros out of this. So able to reduce culling rate and aid in overall management of the Gilts. Now I'll see if this one works. So it's been heavy with words and heavy with a lot of discussion. So I just randomly added this in. Forgive me, it's a little clip of my children.
Seasoning for the bacon. That's more seasoning. Seasoning for the bacon. Seasoning for the bacon.
I was afraid that they go, Mom, what's happened to these pigs? And like, they're gonna get killed. They're gonna go to slaughter, and I'm so sad. And Connor's like, heck no, like, this is my bacon. I like bacon. Let's make sure they're taken care of very well. So it was a little proud moment that I wanted to show you. But okay, then I'll just take your attention for the last scenario here, and we'll get going on. So second scenario, different use of Regulate. So in this situation, use with Gilts that did not cycle, and I'll walk you through it again. So 2400 sow herd, PIC genetics. The concern was that they were consistently having 10 to 15 problem gilts in each group every 5 weeks. When gilts wait around, they gain condition, and that impacts their longevity, and we wish to make that gilt pool more efficient, right? So we always had this holdout group. So the gilt flow in this circumstance was every 5 weeks, about 135 gilts entered from an external isolation barn. So they'd go into ISO, they'd sit there for a period of time, and then they'd come into the sow barn. About 10% of each group did not show a strong heat and therefore weren't bred and ultimately culled. But we had a tendency to keep them around longer, right? Because you want to try. Heat checks were conducted daily with a bore and a pen, and bores are switched up, so mindful of that. Not all gilts were heat no serviced at entry, so if they were big enough, if they were old enough, and we needed them to meet target, they were bred. And so they might have been bred on their first heat versus the second. But too many gilts not coming into obvious heat at all, and then they ended up being culled or hanging around too long, like I alluded to. So this treatment guideline. So gilts entered into the sow barn. We checked them for regular heat for the first 21 days. At 21 days, if a gilt did not show any signs of heat and ultimately was not bred, so she didn't show us any signs of estrus by 21 days, then she was put on Regulate. And this is where I really pushed the 14 versus 18 day scenario. So then they were put on Regulate for either 14 days or 18 days, taken off Regulate, and then heat checked for a good 10 days thereafter. And then the concept was, is if there was no heat after that point, then they were potentially a candidate for culling. So this data is, we're going to take it with a grain of salt. And the reason for that is that the first Regulate group that came in, or the first isolation group that we intended to do the Regulate on, was a bit of an anomaly. So they were, as you'll see, slightly younger in average entry in age, so that skewed this population a little bit. They were smaller than historically, and a little more variation in that size. So what we did find, though, is that we still bred most of them regardless. The average entry to first service interval, 18 days historically. On this group, 24 days, but I think that's going to be attributed to the fact that they were smaller. So that's why I'm taking this information with a grain of salt, but I still think there are nuggets of information here that are helpful. Oops, sorry. The average weight was about the same, so this is a reflection of, okay, they came in younger, I had to wait a little bit longer to service them to get them to the weight that I needed to breed them at. And the farrowing rate is pretty even. So the ones that we were successful with did perform to our expectations. So this one just took a snapshot here of entry to first service, so less than 21 days. Historically, we might have had 62% bred within less than 21 days. In this Regulate trial, we only had 45. Again, a bit of a reflection of the population we were working with. Entry to first service, and it's 46 days here because we put them on Regulate, some of them for 18 days. So 18 days plus 7 plus 21 is our 46 versus 42, which is what we'd work with in a 14-day trial. And then 46 days plus. This whole slide is to sort of show you that we didn't appreciate massive differences in this protocol. And in this particular situation, I think that first group being a bit of an anomaly kind of threw out the window, is this a good management tool or not? Because you can also imagine if you're not used to, and I think I'll go into it here shortly, but I allude to it again a little bit later, like when you have all of a sudden this group that, okay, we're going to try a new protocol on with Regulate. I haven't used Regulate a lot in the past, and now all of a sudden I've got like double or triple the amount of gilts that hold out by 21 days, and now she's telling me I got to put them on Regulate, and I got to sort out where the gilts go in this barn, and I was only expecting 10 or 15 by that time, and now I've got 30 to 40. That was a little bit of a kerfuffle, right? So we're using some of these insights to sort of educate us as to whether we continue, or in this scenario, maybe it's not worth continuing, but that's good information as well. So this is the cool part, though. This is one of the things I gleaned from this. Gilts bred post-Regulate. 14 days versus 18 days. There's not a hang of a lot of difference. There is a numerical difference, but I'll tell you that there's not a huge difference, I think, if we increased our N here. So we were getting gilts bred just as easily if they came into heat, if they were on 14 days of Regulate versus 18 days. Average breed day post-Regulate, virtually the same. So we could appreciate a heat thereafter, and it's not a huge difference. And strong heats, there was not an appreciable difference between whether they got it for 14 days or 18 days. If they came into heat, they stood strong. So, like I said, you know, big group at the beginning, so it was a little bit of a, okay, how are we doing this? What are we doing here? There was a bit of fuss with applicators initially, so some were leaking and we had to switch the drencher, which is the reason that I would use a training day. Even if the gilts take it very easily and you don't necessarily have to train them as much, sometimes it's good to make sure everything's functioning properly and you're administering the right doses and the applicator works. The animals learn to love the taste after a day, so that was a common feedback, which is great to hear. It did not save them all, so the results weren't perfect. But speaking to these folks, you know, we could see that this is a tool in some circumstances, but they're really leaning into, I want a slightly older, less variable group of gilts coming in, and that might help solve my problems versus fussing with this at this point. So I just said all this, but basically it's, in this circumstance, size really played a big role for the predictability of those girls to come into heat in certain timelines. And no obvious advantage to give Regulate for 18 days, which is versus 14 days, because that's something I'd wrestled with. You have some European counterparts with some European genetics maybe coming into the market, and they're going, you have to give it for 18 days. And I'm going, I've gotten away pretty good with only giving it for 14. So where's the difference there? That's 4 extra days that they're not necessarily productive. That's 4 extra days that I'm feeding them something that I'm paying for. Can I get away with 14? And I think we're leaning towards, yeah, there's not really evidence here to suggest that you have to go 18. So some takeaway messages overall. What's the problem you're trying to solve with your gilts, right? So there's various different things that we're looking at. Regulate can be used as a tool, and we saw it make better use of some gilt pools. And the first scenario was culling less at the end of the day. The size and age of the incoming gilt populations can directly impact some of the success of these processes. The use of Regulate is not for everybody. It's very situationally dependent. That's absolutely obvious. So I guess what I wanted to say is that we've initiated various interventions in different herds, but we can still do better, right? We can still tweak these things. There's not one size fits all. There's not one recipe. So we want to continue to explore options on how to use tools like this. We believe there's opportunity in maximizing this population and their performance. Reducing even the frustration of these guilty parties, right? So that might be a #1 priority for you, getting through and dealing with this subgroup. And so we want to further refine things. Being smart and strategic are very important. So stay tuned, as we would say. And if you've got any ideas, like, we're all ears. This is something we can play with to sort of facilitate a strategic protocol for your herd to see if it can improve, whether it's management, whether it's efficiency, all of those things sort of rolled together. These are my guys again. Thanks a lot.
The two-part question. Do you, on our sow farms, we always lean, or have always leaned towards PG 600. In your opinion, which is more successful, and what would you rather reach for these problem gilts? And the second part, is there any data, or have in your trials, or any trials out there that you're aware of that follow these gilts that are regulated through the farrowing rooms for born alive, and then even post-weaning for breed back on as a P1?
Yes. So I can try to answer them to the best of my ability. So I believe that performance, so let's say total born after a regumate. So you're either pregnant or you're not, and then the success rate does it affect sort of ovulation rate or total born at the end of the day, right? And if I'm not mistaken, some studies would show that that can be directly related to maybe strength of heat and timing of breeding, more so than use of regumate. So if you have a girl on regumate and you pull her off and you expose her to a boar and she stands readily for you, the fact that she was on regumate previous should not detrimentally affect her performance going forward. So that would be the first one. The use of PG 600 is slightly different. So if we look back at our hormones that I talked about initially, it's boosting that waterfall effect. It's not stopping anything. And if you give PG 600 when you have high progesterone, it won't do anything. So that's where the strategy comes into it, right? So you can give PG 600 and it will work and it will not work. And the reason that it sometimes doesn't work is because you've got a big chunk of her 21-day cycle that she won't be responsive to it because progesterone is high. So it's a different strategy by which to bring on heats and gilts, but it's the reverse of what we're doing. Some people will actually use regumate and PG 600. So to enhance the effect or the time frame by which they're pulled off regumate and express heat, but that can get pretty costly in a hurry. So depending on your circumstance and where your problems lie, one could be useful versus the other. You could use both in some circumstances, but you really gotta understand what you're trying to target at the end of the day. Does that answer your question? Thanks, Joe.
Hey, Christine.
Hey.
It said it reduced or had a positive impact on culling rate. Can you elaborate on that?
I wish I could give you absolute numbers, Kevin. At the end of the day, I believe that, 30% was less. But I don't know that I can give you an exact on what that less was. So they got more bred by using the regumate. And I would wager to believe that some of those girls that might come in smaller or just less advanced in their reproductive cycles could benefit by just sort of holding things in a bit of a holding pattern with the progesterone for a little bit longer. They were able to mature through that time period, and so when you pulled it off, they gave you a nice heat if they were on for a longer time. And so those are the girls that maybe we weren't capturing without using it. Unfortunately, I don't have exact numbers at this point, but they weren't sending 30% out the door. Mm-hmm. It is, just in general, it's about $1.33 a day for a gilt, and then about $1.70 and change for a sow. So you can sort of, that is involved in the strategy when we're looking at specific situations for different herds.
One more question here.
Sorry, I was going to ask, but not the cost of it. What was the ROE on that farm that was doing all the gilts versus, I mean, just straight up versus the cost of the product versus the savings of not culling gilts? I'm assuming that's what it was.
We can't say that fully. That's why I didn't put it up there. And the reason for that, it's not tidy. I don't know exactly how many were not culled. You can add up the cost based on the number of days, total days that gilts were on Regumate, but I can't directly relate it back to how many they saved. And in that situation, it was a factor, but not the driving factor. And to my knowledge, the management with this tool in place the way it is, they're continuing. So if that says something, then there's got to be a return on some level of investment, whether it's monetary or frustration, if that makes sense. Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine.